Afternoon. So we were discussing last time some of the distinctions of juvenile corrections institutions, but there are some rare conditions in which juveniles can be waived into adult instruction correctional facilities as well. Like much of our court system, this is distinguished by which state you live in. Each state represents its own unique legal system, if you will. So there are several types of waivers. And again, this is involving a process where juveniles are waived into adult correctional facilities. As always, when you see a concept presented in italics, that's definitely something that you want to study closely and prepare for the final exam. And also our second quiz. So the judicial waiver, again, is where the juvenile court makes a decision to waive the juvenile to adult court. There are some states that give the prosecutors this authority. So this is where the prosecutor can decide to try you as a juvenile or as an adult. And then there's statutory exclusion. We've talked about precedents in statutory cases throughout the semester and throughout your matriculation as criminal justice students. So there are some offenses, usually murder, rape, something really violent and egregious, where you're automatically referred to adult court. The judge, the prosecutor has no choice over this at all. So again, if you see these on the exam or the quiz, use the words themselves. Prosecutorial waiver, prosecutorial waiver. Obviously, that's coming from the prosecutor. Judicial waiver. That's obviously decided by the judge. And the statute is established law in the given state. Judge, prosecutors have no say-so whatsoever. So please make note of that. Don't just try to memorize the definition. There's, frustration at times where we go over this stuff. I've seen with my own eyes people taking notes, but then we have a utter inability to discuss these things that we're writing and reading. It's truly amazing to see. We obviously want to reduce the amount of waivers, the amount of juveniles that are waived into the system. So there have been steps taken to curb this. So it's been almost a 70% decline from the mid-1990s. You won't be tested on these numbers, just to give you some context of the historical patterns. And a large part of this is that states have invested more in juvenile facilities. For a lot of times, states just didn't have the institutional capacity to meet the rise in juvenile arrests. And a really controversial topic, the final chapter we're going to talk about in this class is death penalty. And keep in mind that there are only a handful of nations, so there are probably about 300 some countries in the world. Maybe like 5 use the death penalty. So oftentimes very repressive regimes like North Korea, China, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, I think, and then the good old United States. Now you would think, of course, the notion is that we use the death penalty, again, punishment is supposed to deter crime. So you would think that in a nation that uses the death penalty, if people knew that they could die, you would have a whole lot less murders, right? That should, again, be our logic as criminal justice scholars. Again, if we're punishing just to punish, that's not really the purpose. The goal is to reduce crime, not just to punish criminals. If people are still getting killed, if somebody were, God forbid, to kill my mother, killing another person doesn't necessarily do anything to relieve that. Additionally, there have been, as we've seen with many elements of the criminal justice system, the criminal justice system gets things wrong all the time. So I'm sure you all are intelligent enough to know, and we've seen enough cases in this class alone, that there have been people that have been incarcerated, and that it turned out that DNA evidence and things like that would eventually exonerate them and show that they had not done the crime. Unfortunately, we've seen this with the death penalty as well, as people have been put to death, and we've later learned through scientific evidence, irrefutable scientific evidence, that they actually were not the ones that committed the murder. So we want to, if we must use the death penalty, and again, there's no data to suggest that we really need to, or that it has any effect, we continue to go on killing people anyway. Dylan Root knew that he probably could get the death penalty if caught. Like, that didn't stop him from, committing that horrible atrocity. So maybe, again, we want to look into other avenues, and particularly when it relates to juveniles. Because at the time, before Roper versus Simmons, we've talked a lot about statutes before. 16 and 17-year-olds were eligible for the death penalty. This is allowed in 21 states, that if you were a juvenile and you committed a murder, you would get the death penalty. And keep in mind, right, we talked about last class, when we looked at the statistics, and of course you should do your own research on this, but Black and Hispanic juveniles are funneled through this system at a much higher rate. So a lot of times these would be Black and brown kids that would, lose their lives at the hands of the state. But in a 5-4 decision, the court ruled that it was in violation of the Eighth Amendment's ban on cruel and unusual punishment. And this is working off the premise that, this don't mean that, if you're a juvenile, you get to, again, you are not getting off for your crime. You probably still gonna spend your life in jail. But you are gonna get, the death penalty. Based mainly off the premise that they lack the maturity and sense of responsibility found in adults. Again, ignorance of the law does not excuse you from it, so you're still going to be held accountable. And life sentences for juveniles has not only been confined to murder. We talked about, again, violent crimes. The most violent criminals, again, the main purpose of prison, more than anything else, is to make it where the dangerous people in our society are kept away from us. It is for the dangerous people in our society to be kept away from us. It's not for people that had, like, a blunt in a car. It ain't for, again, people that have bounced checks. It's not to protect us from people that are abusing prescription drugs. Like, that's not, again, if we think that should be the purpose, that's a different discussion, but that's not what it was formed for. But violent criminals, rapists, murderers, pedophiles, yes, those people, we have to, institutionalize as long as possible. So we saw this, for example, with 2 juveniles who had raped an elderly woman in Florida. One when he was 13. He was sentenced to life in prison. So again, it doesn't excuse you from your behavior. It just, determines whether or not we think we should kill, teenagers at the hand of the state. Another important case in this discussion is Miller versus Alabama. Again, these are not easy philosophical issues. So I hope, again, that, you'll think critically about them, because some of these things you will be responsible for, your generation will be responsible for, kind of deciding and adjudicating. But Justice Elena Kagan, appointed by President Obama, she made an argument that mandatory life without parole, it precludes the consideration of their chronological age. And it's understood that when you're young, you're going to be more immature, you're going to be more impetuous. You are going to be more likely to not really appreciate the risk and consequences of your choices, as we see with, even in college age students every single day. And like we talked about with the child savers movement on Monday, it also prevents, again, it takes into account the environment that, young people are growing up in. Again, being a product of your environment does not excuse you from wrongdoing. It does not. But when we talk about, mitigating circumstances, it is important to keep these things into account. Today, there are nearly 3,000 people as young as age 13 and 14 that are doing life sentences as juveniles. Again, some cases, like when we talk about the case in Florida of a rape, that one, again, we can rationalize. But there was even a situation like a few years back, you all may have heard about this case, like there was this dude, he was wrestling with his sister. He was just playing around. And he did a wrestling move and he accidentally killed her. And they end up sentencing him for murder. The case eventually got, because it got national attention, and this is why, again, the intent, the motive, it matters. Where is he just going to be allowed to walk necessarily, from and act like that? No, but I think we're intelligent enough to know that he was not trying to kill his sister. And what are we trying to accomplish here in locking him up in prison forever? Next time we'll talk about corrections programs and services. We've discussed a lot about the rehabilitative nature of prisons and some of the services that are provided there. But we've also talked about the controversies over the cost of taxpayers over some of these services. Their food, religious rights, rights to education, etc. So we're going to start unpacking that on Monday as we get into chapter 9. As always, try reading in advance to give yourself a broader understanding. And make note that your papers are coming up due, so please get to work on those as they'll be coming up rapidly. Have a wonderful weekend.